Hey guys, and welcome to the tutorial on how to make this compound bow. Hopefully today I'm going to be explaining every step of the process of making this bow to you, but if you still have any questions, leave them in the comments section down below. So this bow was originally made of oak and it had an oak core that looked really nice, but then when I tried to pull it back it couldn't take the draw weight and it snapped. I then had to reinforce it with plywood, but this would be a completely unnecessary step if I'd made the core originally out of plywood, which would have been easily strong enough from the beginning. After I'd fixed the bow, it fired pretty powerfully, and when I tightened up the string it was shooting at an alright speed. I have a separate video on my channel of just shooting the bow, so there'll be a link in the description down below to the shooting video. So if you don't already know what a compound bow is, I'm going to explain it to you now. It's basically a more complicated version of a bow, where it's got pulleys on the end of each of the limbs, and when you pull back the main bowstring it's hard at first, but as you pull it back further and further, at the very end it gets much easier, and this is called let off, and it means that you can hold it at full draw length with much less effort. On this video here you can see how the let off is working before I tighten off the bowstring with a very low draw weight. This project is pretty hard to make, and I wouldn't recommend it if you don't have any experience in woodworking, because you need quite a lot of tools and materials, so I would recommend making a few projects before making this one. So now let's see how to make it. The first thing that you have to do is go to the link in the description of this video and download the blueprints. You need to download both half of the blueprints for the riser and also the blueprints for the cams. Print off both different halves of the riser and then glue them together, and then you can cut them out. Once they're glued together they should look something like this, and this should roughly fit your hands. You now need to draw it out onto some wood, but I strongly advise not using oak wood after what happened to me, so I'd recommend using 18mm multiplex birch plywood. If you use plywood it'll easily be strong enough for this design. Here you can see that I've traced the full outline of the bow onto one of the longer pieces of oak, and then I've traced the two smaller halves onto the smaller piece of oak. I'm now going to go and cut them out on my scroll saw. For this you can use pretty much any saw that's able to cut the corners. You could even just use a wood saw if you're willing to spend a lot of time, but I do strongly recommend using a scroll saw or a jigsaw because you'll save a lot of time. I was actually quite surprised at how quickly and efficiently my scroll saw was cutting the thicker oak wood, since I do consider oak quite a hard wood to cut. Once the two halves have been cut out, they can be placed together over the blueprints, and as you can see I've cut pretty close to the lines. Once the back piece is cut out I can line up the pieces and they look something like this. Now I'm going to clamp them up in my vise and glue them all together using wood glue. I need to try and line them up properly, and you could also use epoxy resin, but I prefer using wood glue since it's cheaper. It's important not to apply too much pressure or you'll squeeze all of the glue out. Now it's time to start rasping and shaping the riser so that it looks nice. For this I'm going to be using a wood rasp, but you could also use a belt sander or a Dremel tool, and I don't recommend using a Dremel tool because you're likely to go through quite a lot of Dremel pieces, but you can use one. I'm going to start by using the rasp to form the riser into the basic shape and lining up all of the edges which weren't originally aligned. Once I'm done, the riser looks like it's been cut out of one solid piece of oak. I'm now going to start to round it so that it looks nice and also so it doesn't dig into my hand. First I'll grab it in my hand around the bit which is the handle and feel where it digs in, and then I'm going to start to curve it with the rasp. I would recommend making the bit between the webbing of your thumb and finger slightly wider, since I accidentally made it a little bit thin and was worried about the strength of it. Once I've sufficiently rounded the handle and it feels alright in my hand, I'm going to start to flatten all of the edges and round them. I also flatten off any of the surfaces which had the grooves in, because these oak floorboards were originally floorboards. Once I finish with the rasp it looks very rough, but it is rounded and it feels quite nice. Now it's time to start work on removing all of the deep scratches left behind by the rasp before I start sanding up all of the wood. For this I do recommend using a Dremel tool since it can save a lot of time and effort, but you can also use a metal file or some 80 grit sandpaper wrapped around a wooden dowel. Using the Dremel tool I'm getting out any scratches left behind by the rasp and just making it a flat surface. Once that's done and there are no large scratches or grooves left in the wood, I'm then going to start work on sanding all of the wood all the way up to a very high grit. For this I'm just using sandpaper wrapped around a metal file, and for the handle part I'm going to be sanding it all the way up to 600 grit, and the rest of the wood is going to be all the way up to 400 grit. For the higher grits, I also like to use sanding sponges since they leave a really cool finish. This is what the wood looks like after sanding, and I think it looks really nice, but it's time to oil it. This oil is going to help to waterproof and protect the wood, as well as bringing out the grain. I've just used sunflower oil, and I think it looks really nice once it's done. The grain is much more prominent and the wood is much darker. Now the rise is finished, and I'm going to start work on making the cams. The cams are being made out of some 9mm multiplex plywood with a lot of layers. It's important that you use plywood since it's strong in every direction, but you could also use strong plastics or metal. This plywood is high quality plywood because, as you can see down this edge, it's got no voids or spaces in between the layers, and it's also got a lot of layers, and it's very dense, hard, strong wood. Here I've cut out the designs of the cams from the description of this video, and I've then traced them onto the wood like this. I printed the design of the cam out twice and then cut out each part out of a different one, and then I traced it down onto the wood. I then also drew in all of the holes where I'm going to need to drill holes through later on. I'm now cutting out the cams on my scroll saw. As always, when using my scroll saw, I'm trying to cut exactly to the lines so that I have no filing or shaping to do later. This is what all 4 pieces look like after cutting out, and they're pretty good so far. I'm now using a rat tail rasp to create the groove which the string is going to be sitting into. It's important that I make this really deep, otherwise whenever you fire the bow, then the string will pop out of the groove. I'm making sure to make the groove also consistent and straight down the middle of the plywood so that it doesn't warp or try and bend. This is what the groove looks like once it's done, and it's definitely sure that the string is not going to be popping out of it. Here I've drawn on where the small cam is going to sit on top of the big one, and that's in the blueprints of the cams. Here I'm using my drill press to drill through all of the holes which were in the blueprints of the cams, and I'm using a 3.5mm hole because I've got 3.5mm nails which are going to be going into it to act as pins. You don't have to use a drill press, but I strongly recommend one since it's very hard drilling holes vertically with a normal hand drill. I then clamp up and glue each piece of the cams together so that they fit together properly. Once the cams are done and the glue is finished drying, I can put the nail through and I can spin it around in the nail so there's no friction. The cam is able to spin freely, but there isn't any wobble in the nail since it's still a tight fit. So that's all for part 1, thanks for watching, and if you want to see part 2, I'll be uploading it next weekend and there'll be a link in the description once it's been uploaded. Subscribe so that you can see when I upload future videos.